Hey, it's Chris, the Supply Chain Doctor. Over the years, I've interviewed some of the brightest minds and successful leaders in supply chain management. In May 2020, I sat down with supply chain leader Ken Ackerman to learn more about him and collect a little supply chain management history. After the interview, Ken told me about a similar interview he had with Dr. Jim Stock many years prior, and the related work Dr. Stock did. In November 2020, I was able to catch up with Dr. Stock to learn about him and his work. As an academic in the world of transportation, logistics, and what we now call supply chain management, Jim was well connected to many of the original academic thought leaders in the space. Jim did interviews with many of these thought leaders and shared them with me. The list includes Ken Ackerman, Don Bowersox, James Haskett, Bud Lalonde, John Langley Jr., Tom Mentzer, Tom Spee, and Daniel Wren. To carry on the great work started by Dr. Jim Stock, I'm dusting off these interviews and bringing them to you to help you get a better understanding of supply chain management and hopefully become a more effective supply chain professional.
He and my mother just said, let's take our savings and walk away. And started their own company. And make a long story short, by the time I was ready to head off to college, my dad was getting close to retiring and owned 4 successful companies. Well, that's a tough model to follow. So I was looking for an engineering school, but I was looking for one where I could pay my own way. And my guidance counselor came up to me during study hall one day and said, have you considered General Motors Institute? And I said, what you say at those times, is I don't want to be a auto mechanic. And she said, no, it's a 50-year-old accredited engineering institute that GM just happens to run. They just started to produce more engineers back in the 20s. And that's kind of how I transitioned from high school to, I applied to GM, went through a ton of interviews, getting accepted in the school, and then getting accepted by a GM plant because you're a co-op student for 5 years. It's a 5-year program, and deciding that that's where I wanted to go. I felt like I didn't have a lot of options because it was there or several other schools where they weren't as strong engineering, and I was going to have to depend more on my parents. My parents were willing to put me through college, but I wanted to kind of go out and prove that I could do it myself.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get into your college years, thinking back through your high school, you mentioned the civics instructor mm-hmm. that you had. What were your favorite courses within the high school?
Well, interestingly enough, civics wasn't it. Civics, I think, was more the instructor mm-hmm. and kind of how things progressed. I have to admit, I did develop, I should have mentioned this earlier, I'm amazed that every American doesn't regularly read the U.S. Constitution. And I think that's what Mr. King got across to me was we are governed by a living document. And this document was written by people who wanted to form a government of the people, by the people and for the people, but we don't trust the people. We can't trust individuals to do the right thing. We can't trust individuals that given absolute power, they won't absolutely use it. So they built what I thought is a marvelously intricate document of checks and balances and the ability to grow. People complain the Constitution's vague in places. It's vague for a reason. It's vague to let 200 years later the documents still run this land. Mm-hmm. And I know the later in life I developed a fascination with the civics part of who we are as citizens. But my interest, I actually thought at one time about majoring in mathematics. I loved math. I loved the elegance of math. You know, one of my daughters is very quantitatively oriented. She understands it. The other is the exact opposite, and she said she gets nauseous when she looks at the pages, some of the articles that you've sent me to read. And, you know, to me, mathematics is just a different language. I mean, in terms of the symbols that we use, you can still read it like a sentence if you want. But I've always been fascinated with the quantitative sciences. That led me to a fascination with physics. I loved physics because mathematically I could figure out why, when X happened, Y happened. I hated chemistry, and as a result, I think I hated biochemistry, because a large part of chemistry, no offense, it's an important area of study, but to me, certainly as a high school student, chemistry was always these logical things happen, and then something happens that we can't explain, and we haven't even got a clue. As far as we know, a miracle's happened, and then we go on and we do these things, and that part in the middle bothered me. You know, I wanted the explanation. I didn't want the you know, a man, a woman go through this physical act, and you know, these various things happen, and then suddenly a new life is formed. A lot of it is chemistry, and it's the part of chemistry that they just say, well, we'll just kind of accept that. So I was definitely a physical sciences kind of guy.
Okay.
Hated French. Love French today. Wish I'd paid more attention, but hated it at the time.
Now, were you active? You mentioned football in one of your comments. Were you active in sports or clubs?
Clubs, not really. I finished valedictorian in my class. Not that hard when there's 42 of us, but still, you know, I finished valedictorian, and I think in the spring, the Honor Society realized, wait a minute, our valedictorian is not a member of our club. Maybe we ought to get this guy in here. So that's the only club I can remember belonging to. I used to say I belonged to the detention club, because I was a well-graded, I mean, good, not that straight A would be pushing it, but pretty strong grades. Guy that at the same time got a lot of detention hall. You know, again, back to my mother, my mother's 93 and still going strong, I think, and she'd say, you know, he was always shaving the rules just a little bit.
How would you describe yourself socially in high school?
Oh, when you talked about clubs and football, the football, I was a good but not great player, I think. I couldn't run worth a darn, and you know, I've somewhere I've got a clipping from my football coach in high school, and he said, anything the guy touches, he catches, and that's a pretty nice characteristic for a receiver. Now, once I caught the ball, I didn't go very far because I wasn't that nimble, I wasn't that fast. So I made the perfect, what's called tight end. You know, a tight end on a lot of plays, actually he's got to be big enough to block, and actually do, you know, be part of the line. But the thing I always thought I knew made me a good tight end is I always knew where the first down marker was. So any play where I was supposed to go out and do something, I always made sure that I passed that marker. So if the quarterback could get the ball there, I was taller than most people, I could reach up the top of the pack and catch it. Now, I might catch it and they'd immediately tackle me, but we had a first down. So I think that was my claim to fame in football. My claim to fame in baseball is I'm ambidextrous. I'm left and right-handed. And as soon as my coach figured that out, he said, which one do you bat stronger? And I said, well, I bat right-handed stronger. And he said, well, then every time you go to bat, I want you to bat right-handed. And the first two pitches, if you get a hit, that's great, you get a hit. If you get a ball, whatever. But he said, when you get to either 3 balls or 2 strikes, or both of them at the same time, he said, I want you to step out of the batter's box and clean the mud off your shoes and fiddle around a little bit, and then step back up and bat left-handed. And he said, there isn't a pitcher in the world that's going to be able to adjust to that. And they're invariably going to either throw the ball behind you or so far out that you're going to get walked. And he said, whatever you do, once you do that, don't swing at that pitch, because that pitch is going to be wild. And it worked. I always could get, it was like being always knowing where the first down marker was. I could always get to first base. I mean, we might not get any further, but I was I made it to first base.
Interesting.
So I those are, and I ran track just to stay in shape. But I said I consider myself kind of a good but mediocre athlete.
Now, the next question was your sort of social life in high school. How would you describe that?
I like women. I've always liked women. I liked women in high school. I was fortunate enough to marry somebody that after 30-some years I'm still totally enamored with. But I like dating. Brenda and I both talked at the time about the fact that we grew up in a time where you didn't go out as groups. A lot of the kids today, they go out as groups. We went out as you had a date, and you might end up in a group together, but everybody was paired with somebody. So I really enjoyed the dating scene. And Fridays and Saturday nights, something was wrong if you didn't have a date. I was 6'5" at the time. I grew another inch as years went by, but 6'5" at the time and weighed less than 200 pounds. So I was a tall, skinny guy with a full head of hair at the time, and so I certainly wasn't ugly to look at. So I had a good time.
Now, considering that period of your life, what would people find surprising about you when you were a teenager? Is there anything that they wouldn't know or would find surprising about you at that time?
I'm probably the high school student you'll well, that's probably not true anymore nowadays, unfortunately, but certainly during my time, I was the only student in my school that was the center of investigation center of an FBI investigation.
Wow. I'm not sure that's very common even today.
Yeah, but there was a place where, again, I grew up a country boy, and we used to hunt, and I became very good over the years. I grew up on a farm, did a lot of shooting, so a lot of target shooting, but a lot of hunting with my father and rifle shooting. So I never was very good with a pistol because they don't have a lot of use on a farm. But on a farm, a shotgun, a rifle are basically tools. And I got a lot of opportunity to practice. My father was very good with guns. He was very big on teaching gun safety, and then letting us practice. So I was a very good competitive skeet shooter with shotguns, and actually was rifle champion several years at Virginia, or excuse me, at GMI, because I was a very good rifle shooter. But one of the things I told my dad, or my dad told me once, he said, it took me half a century to kind of figure out what it did you until you were 14. I realized I liked shooting, I liked hunting, I liked, the skill it took to have a target and hit it, but I didn't like killing things. So I hunted a lot with my dad, but when something was available, I'd never shoot it. I've talked to one of my colleagues. I said, I went deer hunting. I've been deer hunting many, many times. I've never shot at a deer, but I just wanted to see how close I could get to the deer before it realized I was there and would take off. So anyway, a long way around, there was a place where we used to dove hunt, and this place that we had permission from the farmer to hunt doves was right near the old Norfolk, and I guess it was B&O back then, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Has been bought by, it's part of the Chessie system now. But it was right by the railroad tracks, and the place where you parked was the rail maintenance area. And again, we knew it's a small town, everybody knows everybody. I got permission to park the cars there, and we weren't going to break any really big rules. So I got called out of class one day, and I get this, I'm in the middle of something, and they call me to the principal's office. The FBI needs to talk to you. Well, my credibility in high school instantly went up considerably. I was an FBI investigative target. And these two guys came in. I was too dumb to call my parents or call their lawyer. And they wanted to talk, and they said, "Do you own a red sports car?" And I did. I owned a car I wish I still had today, a 1957 MGA convertible.
That's what I had.
Did you really?
Same year, red color.
Red, fire engine red.
Fire engine red. The battery was behind the seats.
Yep. Wasn't that a great car?
Yeah, it was.
There's always something wrong with it, but just a great car. So yeah, I drove a quote red sports car. And they said, asked me a couple other kind of innocuous questions, and then they said, do you have a 20 gauge shotgun? I said, yeah, I do. A little single shot. Is this one of your shells? And now I'm starting to get suspicious. The teenage brain, it's finally sinking in. There's a pattern to these questions. So I gave my first circumspect answer. I said, my shotgun fires shells like that. That's not necessarily one of my shells, but it fires shells like that. And I guess they'd had this incident where the red sports car was parked in the parking lot, and someone was dove hunting, like we do, and decided they weren't getting many doves that day. So it was kind of fun when the B&O, when the train came by to blast the windshield out, and that's back when trains still had to have a caboose on the end, because you had a conductor. Even on a freight train, you had a conductor. And his job on a freight train was to ride in the back and every so often call the engineer, because the train might be 2 miles long, and say, is the front of the train still moving? And if the answer is yes, well, we're not. Something's wrong along the way. And this guy shot out 3 of the windows in the caboose, and fortunately didn't hurt anybody, but I'm sure scared the daylights out of the conductor. I think we're gonna take you into town for further discussion. You should call your parents. So by this time I finally call them, meet me at the I never even knew where the FBI headquarters in Charlestown, West Virginia was, and they took me in to talk, and I finally, as we were going through this discussion, I said, this is very generic, and they were talking about charges, and it's a federal offense, and it's assault, and these are serious, and you're 17, so you may not be you might not be charged as a juvenile. I mean, I'm looking at a very different career path all of a sudden, and I finally had a chance to think about it, and I said, you know, the gun that I have that fires shells like this is a single shot. And I said, I'd have had plenty of time to reload from shooting out the windshield of the train until the caboose went by 10 minutes later. But there's no way I could have fired 3 shots into the caboose with this gun, because I simply couldn't unload and reload it that fast. And the FBI agent kind of scratched his head for a while and looked at his partner, and he said, we're going to go talk to your dad for a while. And yeah, they kind of went out and had a little conversation with my father, and they came back in and they said, well, we want to warn you about a couple of things about parking on Norfolk or B&O property without permission. And I said, well, wait a minute, I had permission. And, you know, dove hunting so close to the railroad. Well, I had permission of the farmer to be dove hunting. Okay, well, we're gonna let you go, but if you think of anything else, let us know. And as we walked out, my dad put his hand on my shoulder and he said, it's a darn good thing you thought of that loading the gun so fast, because they were about to throw you in jail. So that's probably something that would, you know, if you saw me up in front of class saying, you know, he was an FBI person of interest at one time, might surprise him.
Well, I can't think of any examples that even come close to that in mind, but let's move into the college era. You mentioned General Motors Institute. Did you put yourself through school? Did your parents help you? How did that go? Were you the first person in your family to go to college? No, my sister, I have an older sister, and 2 years older than I am. She went to college. She graduated after me just because of you know, some extra classes she took, and she was a teacher, so she had some teaching certificate time that was required in West Virginia. But I had a cousin that from the same family group who was a teacher, and she was a good 10 years older than I was, so she'd been to school. My cousin Eddie, who was 15 years older than I am, I know he went to college. My mother's brother was a trained engineer, that's how she and my dad met, was through her brother, because he and my dad were both engineers at the same plant. My father never had more than a high school education. He got through high school, but barely, if you look at the academically. My mother never went to college, but, you know, for women of the time, she wasn't immediately getting married out of high school, so she went to business college and essentially learned not just secretarial skills, but learned the business, how to keep books, business accounting, so that she could be the office manager of an office. She eventually ended up being the woman who ran my dad's offices for him. So no, there was a good smattering of. There was never any doubt in the Mentzer family. There was never any question in anybody's mind. It's just, I mean, the idea that my sister Susan and I were not going to go to college was just not a consideration. So it's very different than that first person. Now I'm one of the first people from
Harper's Ferry from my class to go on for a graduate degree. I'm actually one of very few from my class that actually went on to college. So I didn't grow up in a town where many people went on to college, but I certainly grew up in a family where that was expected.
Cool. Now the GMI would have been in Michigan.
Yes.
And you're in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yep.
Did they have dormitories? Did you have apartments? Where'd you live while you were a student?
It's actually fairly innovative. At GMI, they have a dormitory for the freshman class to kind of get you oriented, and after that, you're on your own. And what happened was I went to school in Flint, Michigan, at General Motors Institute, but my sponsoring plant, the plant that wanted me as an engineer when I graduated, was in Wilmington, Delaware. So literally, Jim, for 4.5 of my 5 years, the last half year was staying in one place, which was wonderful. Mm-hmm. Staying in one place and actually working on a thesis. But the first 4.5 years were live in Wilmington, Delaware for 6 weeks, pick everything up and move to Flint, Michigan, and freshman year live in a dorm for 6 weeks, and then 6 weeks later turn around and go back and forth all year round. It was a 12-month-a-year school all year round till the next, till you were done. And what happened after the first year was most of the students, we had a very strong fraternity system at GMI, and I think that was by necessity as much as tradition, because you had these houses that, you pledged them your freshman year, and if you joined them, you had a place to live while you were in Michigan. Invariably what would happen was that you'd find these groups of students who would team up, and you have what were called A section and B section. I was in A section, which meant that third week of August I headed off to Michigan and I went to school for 6 weeks. And for those 6 weeks, my counterpart in B section came back to Wilmington, Delaware, lived in my apartment, and worked there. And what we'd do is we'd rent apartments. You'd rent apartments with B section guys, and you'd have what was called, but usually the big party was every 6 weeks we'd have changeover weekend. And changeover weekend was when everybody was in the same town, and we'd have usually a big party, and then either head to work the next morning or head off to class the next morning. There was a very complex social structure that had kind of developed around the necessity of having to. You couldn't spend 8 times a year looking for a place to sleep.
Now, how did that experience, your engineering in GMI?
Yeah.
What about that experience led you to go on for a master's degree, not in engineering?
That's an interesting question. Good question. Along the way, I was a mechanical engineering student. I went there. That's what I wanted to do. I said I love the mechanical stuff. And my freshman year, I figured out that just managing the design of stuff was boring. Managing the people who did that was pretty interesting stuff. So at the end of my year, now it's just something about the kind of school that I went to. I had to get permission from the plant manager, where I worked, to change my major. And I changed from mechanical engineering to what's called industrial administration.
The Supply Chain Doctor interviews thought leaders and visionaries who have had an impact on the field of supply chain management, shares professional development concepts for practitioners, and investigates current and future trends in the industry. Interested in sponsoring this show to help you get your message out? Send a note to chris@thescdr.com. We can also help with world-class supply chain education and workshops for you and your team. Thanks for listening.